was born in Mozambique, which used to be a colony of Portugal, and it was still a dictatorship. My father had a small accounting business, but his big love was wildlife conservation, and so he evolved into that more and more, almost full time. And as a result of that, we lived in the African bush in Mozambique, in the central part of Mozambique, near one of the biggest game reserves, which is sort of went down after the revolutions and so on, but it's now being rehabilitated by a couple of American businessmen. My parents were European, but my mother and her family had actually grown up in the colonies because of my grandfather's work. And she studied to be a concert pianist, so you can imagine in the middle of the bush she would play the piano and the violin and all of those wonderful instruments. So I'm sort of multicultural. For me as a child it was wonderful because I don't like big cities, I don't like big parties and that sort of thing. So it was a little bit on the wild side, but it was great because I had the best of both worlds. You know, I had my parents and their European culture, but at the same time I was Africa born and all my friends were black. They were all Africans and a lot of Indians as well as Chinese, because Portugal had a lot of colonies. In India was Goa, and in China, Macau. So just like with Hawaii, it's part of the United States, but when a Hawaiian comes here, you know immediately that he is of a different descent and ethnic group. So, but I grew up in a huge multicultural melting pot. And it was wonderful because there was a lot of discipline, but also a lot of opportunities to explore wildlife and climb trees and steal my father's Jeep and that sort of stuff that 7-year-olds like to do.
7-year-olds steal Jeeps?
This one did.
What was it like growing up with your sister?
It was tumultuous because we are like chalk and cheese. Same parents, same upbringing, but we just were totally different. She liked dolls, I liked slingshots. But we both had a love for reading. I wasn't really very close to her. I had a lot of, African friends from the bush, and those were my buddies. That's with whom I really connected.
And going to school in Mozambique, what was that like?
Terrible, because the Portuguese system, as I mentioned, was a dictatorship, and it was religiously controlled, and the schools were too far away, so I actually was homeschooled for primary, and my mom was a tough taskmaster. There was no middle ground with her. You did or died. But it was a good thing. I mean, I got a lot of discipline from her. But eventually, when it was time to go to high school, my parents decided to send my sister and me to British boarding schools to South Africa, because it was still part of the British Empire. South Africa did not become independent until 1961. I went to boarding school in South Africa I had about 3 or 4 words of English, like yes, no, please, WC, and all the basics. But it was very tough because it was total immersion, and everything was in English and Afrikaans, because South Africa was a bilingual country. I grew up speaking Portuguese and Xangan, which is a local dialect in that part of Mozambique. And I had a French grandmother who, whenever we were around her, insisted on speaking French to me. So my French is kind of rusty, but it did give me a good understanding for later on in life.
How many languages do you speak today?
Well, as I said, Portuguese and Xangan were part of my growing up languages, and then English and Afrikaans. And then I worked in Germany, and so I was there for over 5 years. So I learned to speak German as fluently as possible. And then later on in life, I was doing international marketing after I got to the US, and I focused on a lot of Hispanic countries, so I had to perfect my Spanish then. And some others, Hebrew, rusty, what can I say? It gets a bit confusing.
Tell me about your journey to the US.
Yes, I was working in Germany with the US Armed Forces, and I was always being told by some of the officers I worked with, you need to move to the US, you need to move to the US. Well, in those days, you had to go through a very tough application process, and I put in the papers, then I had to be interviewed and all that, but it took over a year to come. But in the meantime, I'd made friends with a couple of American girls who were working as civilians with the US Armed Forces. And one of them, her parents used to visit her quite often, and they were from Oklahoma. And they said, well, if you ever decide to move, let us know, and we'll help you get settled. So eventually, in 1970, I up sticks and moved to Oklahoma. Culture shock. But it was nice. It was Tulsa, which, you know, is very nice. And I was exposed to really lovely people. They were all very kind, very gracious, and they actually steered me in the right direction to find the right job for my background. And I ended up working doing international marketing for an engineering company. When I arrived in Oklahoma, you know, I had to get the legalities, you know, I had to get my green card and my driving license and all those sorts of things whilst I was trying to get myself into the workforce. And as it happened, the company I was working with, they had started their business in Oklahoma, but they had expanded to Texas and some other states. So once I got to working with them, after 2 or 3 years or so, they transferred me to their Texas office. So I ended up in Austin, Texas. So there was a new culture to learn. And I was invited to football games, and I couldn't understand why they called it football, because the foot and the ball never connected. It was sort of an adulterated rugby, but I caught on the enthusiasm, especially between those two, Oklahoma and Texas. You know, they were, especially the university level players. It was very interesting. It was part of evolving into the American culture. When I came to the United States, I was in my late 20s. When I first left university, I finished high school when I was 16, and I did my undergrad in 3 years because, again, it was the do or die thing. And I was then recruited into the Foreign Service. I was part of the diplomatic corps for the Embassy of Portugal in South Africa. After several years, I decided that being in the diplomatic service just wasn't something I was comfortable with. When I came to the US, it was a whole new perspective. I didn't really want to do any of the things I had done before. I just wanted to explore new things. So I started to do some studying in marketing, which I had never done before. I was already working in marketing, but as I worked, I evolved into that. So by the time I was in my early 30s, I had been very blessed by the people with whom I worked, because they knew I was very focused and really liked working, and they promoted that, and it was good for both of us, both the company and for me. So no regrets, except that when I interviewed, they needed somebody who had international background in languages and so on. And they asked me, well, you meet a lot of our needs, but what do you know about centrifugal pumps? And I said, nothing. But what I have would take you forever to learn. What you have, you can help me learn. And if you offer me this job, I will not accept unless you let me go to the factory and work with the factory people and learn how to build centrifugal pumps. How can I market something if I don't know how it works? A lot of the people who worked in the factory, in the assembly, they were Hispanics, so a lot of Mexicans, especially in Texas. So there I perfected my Spanish again, especially from a technical perspective, which was great. You know, in retrospect, you think there was a lot of a road to travel, but I loved every moment of it. You know, things like that were challenges, but you could look back and say, I accomplished this, but it was on my own. There was always somebody there alongside me to help me grow, which was really great. From Texas, I went back to Oklahoma, and then to Colorado, and then to Michigan. And I was in Michigan thinking that, right, I'm going to be here for a while. And by then it was 1985. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was very involved with mission work and had a lot of contacts with people in Africa. At that time, there was a horrible situation in sub-Saharan Africa because of the so-called independent states. They were all fighting each other. There was a lot of wars going on. Refugees, displaced people. It was really, really horrible. And when that started to hit the news, people in this country began to react and say, how can we help? But from a political standpoint, it was not easy for Americans to go into some of those countries. And I was talking to a couple of people, and they said, you're from Mozambique, you grew up there. Have you ever thought about going back? I said, absolutely not. Why would I go back there? What can I do? I mean, I have nothing to offer. Long story short, I was contacted by an organization called World Relief. World Relief was like the Marshall Plan for Europe, but for the evangelical community. They were helping displaced people and refugees and so on. But then after that, they went international. They went into other countries as needed, of course. They contacted me, and it was sort of, they weren't too sure. I wasn't too sure. But one thing led to another. I kept saying, there's no way I can do what you're asking me to do. You have no presence in those countries. It's everything. I mean, there's a huge war going on that you don't even know who the enemy is. They all wear the same uniforms. They all carry AK-47s. Yes, but you speak the language, but you know the culture. And I said, yes, but I can't be posted into Mozambique. They won't allow me, especially because by that time I was an American citizen. As things would work out, I realized that that was really the right thing for me to do. And I'm a strong believer in God, and I don't argue with him. So I said, all right, I'm going not knowing, but I'm going. So I sold everything and I went. And that was early 1986. I thought I would go for a couple of years, and I ended up doing 28.
There's a beautiful photo of you in an article clipping on your wall. Tell me about that photo and that article.
Oh, that was in Mozambique. You know, collateral damage when there's war usually is children. And by that time, HIV/AIDS was raging. I had been asking for help, but people didn't want to talk about it. But I was dealing with the reality of it. So one of the things I was doing was working with local communities and local churches to see if they could lead me to groups of people whom I could work with, because initially I was just doing relief work. But that's not enough, you know, you're just feeding and clothing people in a refugee situation, and that is very destructive to the soul. So I found several older ladies who had lost all their families, and we got them together and started gathering children who were lost, abandoned, orphaned, and we created small enclaves in the different villages. And that particular article was in response to some really, really bad situations, and those children were HIV positive. And sometimes in underdeveloped countries where they don't have scientific knowledge, especially of diseases, they think that it could be witchcraft and all kinds of things. So it was a barrier, difficult to overcome. But you know, when you start dealing with people at the grassroots level, and you sit with them and you cry with them and you eat with them if there's food, and you bring in clothes or medicine, however you can do that, that starts to melt the barriers. And that little girl I was holding was one who was actually dying.
It sounds like your work was very important.
It was. You know, you feel so, I think, small and helpless when the magnitude of these kinds of situations hits you. I didn't get emotional when I was doing my job until the sunset, and then I could walk away and curl up under a tree or something, and then everything would just sort of overtake you. But honestly, those were the hardest things I did that I ever loved. I didn't see myself as being able to help or do anything of value. And what I told the people who wanted to hire me was, I'm not a missionary. I'm not a preacher. I don't sing songs to people. I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm putting people down, but I'm not. I'm just trying to explain those were the kinds of people who were in the field, who would go. I came from the business, the corporate world, and I didn't know how I could possibly help anybody. And I said, I have a business background. I manage things. I solve problems. And they said, yeah, we have enough people who are pastors and missionaries. They're all wonderful, but they don't have what you have. You need to go. Well, you know, I argued with myself, but it didn't work. And in the end, they were right, because I'm a problem solver, and I like to look at situations and say, okay, this is what it is. It doesn't work. Which way can it be fixed? And then look for solutions. But in that process, look around me for other people, hands, arms, feet, minds, whom I could bring in and then resolve things as a team. Because also with cultural differences, I was the white woman, and I couldn't go in and impinge the way things work in the United States. I had to listen to how it worked there with what we had at hand. And it is a process, and by definition it takes time, but it worked because we joined forces. And that's why I couldn't leave after 2 years, because, you know, in the second year, you've only just begun, really. I didn't know they were pushing me. They didn't know they were pushing me, but they really were. We were pushing each other. We were pushing our boundaries just out of pure necessity. When you're in the middle of that, you don't think as clearly sometimes. You have to take a step back and evaluate, and then come up with, you know, which way would things work. One of the things that I learned as a child was the value of human beings. The barefoot person can be very deceiving. It can be a person of extraordinary character and perseverance who's just not in the same line of work that everybody else is, always never had the opportunities. But I always felt that everybody had a certain amount of value. It was just a matter of channeling it and finding out, could they do it alone? Could they do it as a team? And then working with that. So I think that it requires a lot of patience, which I don't have, but I wasn't thinking of being patient. I was in situations that were pushing me to the limit every day, every minute, every hour, going through areas where there was absolutely no transportation, no food, no water, and you just had to make do like everybody else. I couldn't go in and demand things to my standards because those standards didn't exist. It teaches you a certain amount of humility as well, but I think more important, teaches you to value people with a different set of eyes. I had headquarters in one particular country that was safe. It was on the border of Mozambique at the time, where Mozambique was the most demanding. But I ended up working out of Swaziland, which used to be a British protectorate. So English was the common language, but it was pretty safe. So, and also less expensive than other countries. So I ended up setting up an office there and starting to train and recruit people to work in Swaziland with the same situation in terms of HIV/AIDS and other developmental issues. But it was easy for me to travel from there. But Mozambique was the big problem, but it affected all the frontline countries. Malawi, the two Rhodesias, which were Zimbabwe and Zambia, and South Africa as well as Swaziland. And the refugees from Mozambique were going into all those countries. And those countries did not have the means to absorb them, to help them, which is how the first SOS went out to the Western world. We don't know what to do with this. We've never had this situation before. And it's erroneous to think that Africans are all the same, because they're not. It's just like saying that Texans are the same as people from New York. Their cultural differences, ethnic differences, tribal differences, languages, they're all different. So you can't go in with a blanket and say, okay, it's going to cover everybody I have to work with. So you have to step back and inquire, especially from government authorities, because you've got to work under their system. You've got to go to the Ministry of Rehabilitation or of Religious Affairs if it's a religious community, and you have to have their stamp of approval. But that's also very bureaucratic. You could be standing in the queue for days on end before they'll stamp a piece of paper that allows you to travel to a war zone. It was a war zone in Mozambique, but there was a lot of that spilling into the other countries. So refugee camps sprang up around Mozambique, but the problem was within Mozambique. But I had to go there because that was the worst situation. And slowly things began to change as more foreign non-government organizations started to go into these countries and help. So I began to network with people who were coming from different countries like Sweden, Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from the UK. And interestingly enough, I connected with them at the level where I could actually do fundraising from them, because they didn't want to send their own people. They didn't have somebody with my background, and most of them were afraid to go into those war zones unknowing, and they had families to worry about. So I said, right, I'll do the dirty job, but you give me the money. And that's what we did. So I was able to achieve things that I never thought I could achieve just by being cheeky and saying, here's what I need. If you give me the money, I'll do it. You'll get the kudos, but it'll still be our program and our project. And long story short, that's how I ended up in Oregon. When I was still in Mozambique, I decided to take a bit of a holiday, and I came to the States. I was in really bad shape, physically and emotionally and mentally, and my office said, you need a break. Well, I couldn't afford to take a break. But they said, I'll tell you what, we have to send you to different places in the United States to raise funds for your program. And there was so much coverage on local news in this country. And the faith-based community in the United States is fantastic. They are extremely generous. Americans are among the most generous people in the world that I know. So they made a list of invitations for me to go and guest speak. By that time, we had done a couple of videos that showed the work and the need and the situation. And one of them was a very large church here in Boring, Oregon. And my office said, you have to go there and speak at that congregation. So I came to Oregon. I had malaria really badly, and I really looked like death warmed over, and which kind of worked well for me because people felt so sorry for me. Here's this 95-pound weakling out there in the middle of nowhere, so let's just help her. And I mean, I wasn't milking the situation, but you know what I mean. People were very compassionate. After different speaking engagements, one day after another, one of the couples in that congregation mentioned that I probably needed a break. And I said, yes, I could take a few days off, but I don't want to go and stay in a hotel. And they said, oh, we have a cabin here in Oregon. We'll give you a car. You can go and hide. And that's why I did. And I fell in love with Oregon. It was just medicine for me. It was quiet. It was peaceful. I found the people to be really lovely. The salt of the earth, down to earth. And that's what I'm most comfortable with. So that was the beginning of a love affair. And that was in 1989, 1990. So I kept coming back to Oregon, to that and other congregations in Salem and other places. Then I left World Relief and I focused strictly on HIV/AIDS. And I came back to the States, to headquarters. By then, President Bush had come up with the AIDS bill. And I was involved with some other people because we were all boots on the ground and we knew exactly how we could inform the process of coming up with that bill. So I ended up working specifically in HIV/AIDS with a different organization. So I was head of the HIV/AIDS program in Africa. Mostly the same countries where I already had made inroads, where I already had a good base. So going back with a different program was great. And there was the AIDS bill, which was $15 billion for 15 countries, 12 of which were in Africa. So I set out to all 12 of those countries to do a feasibility study to find out where we could go, what could we do, what infrastructure there was. But again, you have to go through the protocol. You've got to work with the ministries of health and education and all that. Because we always believed that education was at the key of changing the tide. I did that for another 10 years. And one day I woke up, I was in D.C., because I spent more time in Africa than I did in D.C., but that was my home base. And I said, I've had enough. I'm going to move to Gresham. So I sold my condo, packed my Jeep, and drove from Washington, D.C. to Gresham in the middle of winter. What can I say? Yes, I came in 2011, and I'd made so many friends here. I had a fantastic safety net, if you will, all as a result of speaking at different congregations. In fact, my best friends to this day are Greshamites. They live in Klatskanai now because they're retired. I came here to where I live, which is a retirement community, because one of the ladies from that congregation became like a surrogate mom to me. And when her husband died and her children were, busy with their lives, she moved to this retirement community and I used to come and visit her. And so I realized that this was a good place for me to move. So that's why I came here. And I was here for several years. And then one day I got a phone call from some friends of mine in Israel that they could use somebody like me to help them with some nonprofit organizations who were also helping with not refugees as such, but these were Jews who were being rescued from persecuted countries, like Ethiopia and Sudan. So I was already working and living here for, I don't know how many years, and I just packed up and went to Israel. I was there for over 5 years, and I just came back last year. Straight back to the same place and straight back to Gresham, because I love Gresham. Gresham is, to me, like a home away from home, thinking of my roots. And the reason is that I'm not a big city person. And I found that Gresham has that good village vibe of community, of people reaching out to one another. But you still have all the amenities you need from a Western standpoint. Don't get me wrong, I also like my creature comforts and having hot water, running water, and being able to go to the grocery store and find the foods that I need is a nice thing. And I have it all here. And I also love to hike. So I did a lot of hiking. I would go down to Medford and stay out there for days and go to waterfalls and all of that. I love horse riding, and I found a nice ranch out near Sisters, where I used to go to de-stress and just spend days riding. But every time I would come back to Gresham, I would just feel this embrace. And you know, an interesting thing, it is bigger than a village, obviously. Supposedly the third largest city in Oregon. But it's the people who really make the big difference. I was gone for over 5 years. I came back last year, as I mentioned. I walk into a store and this woman says to me, "Oh, I know you. Where have you been?" I went to a bookstore, same thing. I went to get my hair cut. It's the same woman who used to cut my hair. And she says, "You're back." I mean, they hadn't seen me in 5 years. And it was like an embrace. You just can't find a substitute for that. I have relatives, but family in the true sense of the word, no, because we're all so dispersed. I was always gone, busy with this and busy with that. I have family with whom I can connect, a handful of those, but like I said, I have a lot of relatives, and I have family living in South Africa, living in Portugal, living in Brazil, living in Finland, in the UK, in Canada. Here in Gresham, I have no biological family, but I still feel like I have a family here, because that's just what Gresham is to me. I think it's the quality of the people here who choose to live here, who choose to make a difference here, and to me that's very important. And you know, living here as I grow older, it becomes that much more important to feel the reaching out of different people, walking down the street and somebody trips and immediately somebody reaches out. You hear about things in the bad news, bad things. On any given day, I seldom see anything other than kindness. People who are very gracious, and people from all different walks of life, which makes it very interesting for me. One of the things that I find here, especially in this community, is that it's very supportive and it's very peaceful. Apart from it being quiet, but there's a support system here that is symbiotic. And it really works for me. I can be as busy as I want to be, or I can stay behind closed doors for as long as I want to be, and people don't bother me. They will come and knock on my door if they haven't seen me in a few days, or if they see me out and about, they want to know how I am, and that's the way everybody is around here. So I feel very blessed to be able to live not only in this community, but in Gresham itself. And you know, I love downtown Gresham. To me, it's like a throwback in history. And when I first moved here, I didn't waste any time exploring Main Street and going, there's a lovely museum there, and I was looking at the history of Gresham, and because I love that kind of history. And talking to people, you know, people, when they see that you're interested, they connect at a totally different level, and I think that's also part of growing, and I love that. Look, I've run multi-million-dollar organization. When I got when we passed the AIDS bill, for the first time, we applied for government money, and I got $10 million, all for my AIDS work in Africa. Only in America. They trusted me, entrusted me with that, and I had to live up to it. I feel from where I sit, I feel very blessed. I've been given opportunities that are extraordinary, and I've never taken that for granted. I've always felt a sense of responsibility to honor somebody's trust, you know, like giving me the whole international marketing department. There I go to Japan, and they wanted me to explore Japan, and I said, I'm going to study Japanese first, at least how to hold a cup and what not to do. But I contacted the U.S. Department of Commerce, and I said, I've just joined a company that is itching to become international. They don't know how. I come from the diplomatic corps background. Every embassy in major cities has a commercial attaché. They are responsible for looking for opportunities for the United States. They look for business people for investment purposes. Can you help me? And phew, yes, come on in. And they opened up the doors for me. They communicated with different countries and said, this is what this company does, and this is the person who is responsible for the marketing. Would you be willing to set up appointments to look for potential partnerships? And because I come from a business background as well, I said, well, I don't want a partnership. We're going to have franchises, and we are going to hold the patents. We don't give those away. And then when Japan came into the picture, I had to be double careful because there, culturally, you're talking about the 70s, a woman, management, foreigner, man's world, those were all negatives. But I decided I was going to turn it into a positive and find out where the barriers were. And if I bumped my head and the barrier didn't go down, then I would walk away. But they always came down. And I went to the university, both in Oklahoma and in Texas, and I asked if they had students from Japan who would be willing to teach me Japanese. And I found one who was actually studying metallurgy. And I said, I'll get you a part-time job, and I'll pay you to teach me Japanese. I did that for 6 months, and it was tough because I had nothing to connect it with. And the wife was gracious because she taught me how women do things differently from men, how you hold your cup and all this kind of stuff. And it served me well because when I arrived there, I knew what not to do that could and would be offensive in that culture. So that in itself was a plus. It was other people who taught me. I worked it, but they taught me. They gave me the tools to do what I could do. And with Japan, that was the only one that was a joint venture. And it was very interesting. The arguments, the fighting of, they wanted 51. I said, no. Why would you want 51? You didn't do any of the hard work. You get 49 at most. And there's my boss, the president of the company, sitting there and taking a back seat. And one man says, oh, tough lady. And I said, yes, now you know I'm tough lady. So 49.51, that's the maximum you're going to get. We got a deal, got a deal. Otherwise, no deal. And we got the deal. And the embarrassing thing was, and it was embarrassing, every time they'd come to the States, they'd bring me Gucci bags and all kinds of stuff, which I wasn't allowed to accept. But if I gave it back to them, it would be the worst offense. So I had this cache of silk scarves and all kinds of stuff that eventually, you sort of repurpose. But it was such a learning experience, It was not easy, but I wouldn't change it for the world. It was part of growing. My French grandmother said to me, the day you stop growing, dig your grave. She lived to be 107. I think the women in my family are notorious for making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. But I didn't tell you about the years I spent in Israel.
It was 5 years?
No, I actually immigrated to Israel. I made what's called Aliyah because I'm Jewish, and you claim your right of return. After the reinstatehood of Israel in 1948, the doors were wide open for Jews to move to Israel. I was with World Relief at the time. I had stopped over in Israel a couple of times for holiday. I like to scuba dive, so I used to go there for just couple of days, 3 days, and go down south to Eilat. I met people along the way who started talking to me about the need to reclaim your roots, and I knew that I had to do that. So I chucked everything and I went to Israel. And I did some studying, and I also did some volunteer work with nonprofits, organizations, Western organizations that work alongside Israel to help raise funds for new immigrants, especially people who come from third world countries, because they come with their clothes on their back. interestingly enough, because of my experience before with development, facing difficult situations in terms of people who couldn't read and write and that sort of thing, it worked for me. And I even was helping a couple, they were from Canada, who had been missionaries in Ethiopia. They were semi-retired, and they started a medical mission for blind people. And then there was a lot of blindness among the Ethiopians. And they were in camps when they first arrived in Israel because, we had to find homes and places for them to live. There came all of that experience of working, in those other countries. The first thing I learned in Amharic was ishi, which means okay. So they would start chatting to me and I would just say ishi. They thought I could speak Amharic. But again, it was another learning experience. And then my old boss called me from the States and said, "What are you doing in Israel? I need you in Angola." So after some thought, I went to Angola to start a new program. It was psychosocial recuperation of at-risk children, victims of the war. And I said, "This time I'm going to tell you I will only do it for 2 years. And every 6 months I have to go home to Israel because the situation in Angola was brutal." I said, I first have to do a feasibility study, turn it into you, and then you decide whom you're going to hire. They offered me the job, and I said, only if you follow my instructions, because I've done this before, and you can't bring somebody who has been behind the desk in an air-conditioned office to go and do this. So I did 2 years of that, and that was brutal because of human trafficking. Really, really, really bad. So then I went back to Israel after the 2 years, and I was offered a position with the Jerusalem University College, and I was working there when the second Intifada broke out, and my mum was on the phone screaming and crying, what was I doing in the war zones all over again. And I said, but if I leave, I'll go back to the States because that's my home. And it's interesting because I just had a feeling I really needed to leave, and I didn't know why. I've just come from the war zones, and I land in the United States when it's just been attacked. So I thought, right, there's got to be something here I can do, roll up my sleeves. But that was the biggest shock to me. I never ever would have imagined that would have happened the way it did. So I came back in 2001, and then that's when I worked the 10 years out of DC. I didn't want to fly through New York City. I specifically asked my travel agent to book me through Newark, New Jersey, because it's a more friendly airport. And then from there I flew to PDX. And my friends from here, from Oregon, were waiting for me. I stayed with them. And we didn't know what had happened because of the time difference. And when we got out of the airport, we hadn't seen each other in a long time. We were chatting, and they said, "You must be hungry. Let's stop somewhere and get something to eat." And when we pulled up to a restaurant, the televisions were just blaring with what was happening in New York. And I thought I had been flown into another world. I could not believe this was happening. I thought it was just a TV film or something. And it was a huge, huge shock, but it was also very sobering. I had to take some downtime for a few months. But again, my office tracked me down, my former office tracked me down, and they asked me to go back to DC. They wanted me to be their liaison with State Department. And I said, no, I am not working with US government or any other government. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to work with an independent, non-profit, non-government organization. And so I turned their job down. And I ended up, because of my involvement with HIV/AIDS, we put together, we meaning people like me who had worked with different NGOs, and we put together an AIDS conference in DC. And it was like a job market almost, because people were looking for people. And that's when I was approached and asked to take over the HIV Africa position. And that's what I did. There are ways of expanding your interests, your mind, your focus on different things, even if geographically it's small or it's limited. One of the things that I did when I moved to the United States is I made myself a promise that I would visit every state of the Union. The only one I haven't been to, and there was a couple of times I planned to, got canceled out of my control, was Alaska. I love to just pack up the Jeep and just take a road trip, stop here and there, meet the local people. I'm not gregarious, but I like to observe things and people, and ended up in somebody's farm because I had a flat tire, and these people pulled up and helped me, and they took me home to their farm, and they said, "Oh, you speak funny, where are you from?" So one thing led to another, and we communicated, we corresponded for years until, well, they were older people, they passed away. But these are the connections that enrich your life. I don't know, it's just, I'm happy in a small place, but I like to think beyond my borders. Sometimes they're geographical borders, sometimes they're not. One of the things that happens here, I was in a store and there were two women talking to each other in Spanish, and their English was very, very limited. And they didn't understand what was on the ticket for the clothes they were looking at. And there is no way that I can see somebody struggling and not saying, "Can I help you?" So I said to them in Spanish, "What can, are you new here?" and so on. By the time they left, they were inviting me to go home for tacos, But that, to me, is the human factor. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, we've lost a lot of that. And coming back again, I find that here in Gresham, because we do have a multicultural community. It's just a matter of paying attention and noticing. In as much as I can help somebody, they can help me in a pickle. So it's a quid pro quo that I absolutely love. So let's keep Oregon safe. And I do get involved. I'm not a political person, but I do get involved with the issues, things that impact all of us as citizens, as residents. I don't want to be an observer. I want to participate as much as I can. I don't need the limelight, but there's always something that I can do. And when I came back here, after being in Israel for 5.5 years, the administrator here said to me, "You're not retiring, are you?" I said, "No, perish the thought." He says, "Well, I've got a job for you." And what did I do when I started this job? Was saying, "Why aren't we members of the Chamber of Commerce?" And there you are.